At 16, I was thrown out into a storm with $23 and a lie my sister told, and my parents never even asked if it was real. 12 years later, I walked onto a stage in front of 600 people, saw them sitting in the audience smiling like nothing ever happened, and realized this was the moment I finally told the truth they never thought I would survive to say. My name is Emily Carter. I'm 28 years old, and I grew up in a house where everything looked normal from the outside, but felt carefully controlled on the inside. The kind of middle-class family that valued appearances more than honesty, where being seen as perfect mattered more than actually being okay. And from a very young age, I understood that there were roles in that house that no one ever said out loud, but everyone followed without question. My younger sister was the one who needed attention, the one who had to be protected, and I was the one who was expected to adjust, to stay quiet, to not create problems. And over time, that expectation became something they described differently, something they framed as concern, calling me difficult, too emotional, or hard to manage, until eventually it turned into something more fixed. Something that sounded almost official. I became the child they couldn't fully control. At first, the differences were small enough to ignore, moments that didn't seem important on their own, but added up over time. Like the way my parents would praise my sister's smallest efforts while treating my achievements as something expected, something that didn't require attention. I remember bringing home a certificate from a regional academic competition, something I had worked on for weeks, standing in the kitchen waiting for them to notice. And my mother smiled politely, said, "That's nice," before turning her attention back to my sister, who was upset about a minor issue at school. And just like that, the moment passed. Not because it wasn't meaningful, but because it didn't fit the narrative they were used to. As we got older, those patterns became more defined, more intentional, decisions that affected our lives in ways that were harder to dismiss when opportunities came up. Camps, programs, extracurricular activities. There was always a conversation about who needed it more. And somehow, that answer was never me. Even when I had earned it, even when it aligned with what I wanted to do, I was expected to step back. Need to give my place to my sister because she needed the support, because she was more sensitive, and I was told that being understanding was a strength, that sacrificing for family was what good daughters did. And for a long time, I believed that. I told myself that it made me stronger, more independent, but there was a part of me that noticed something else, that the more I gave up, the easier it became for them to expect it again. By the time I was a teenager, the gap between how we were treated wasn't just emotional, it was structural. My sister was guided, supported, protected from consequences, while I was held to a different standard, one where mistakes were taken as proof of something deeper, something wrong with me. And even when I didn't make mistakes, even when I did everything right, there was always a sense that I was one step away from being seen as a problem, and that pressure changed how I behaved. I became more careful, more aware of how I spoke, how I reacted, trying to avoid anything that might confirm the label they had already given me. What made it harder was that none of this was ever acknowledged directly. There was no single moment where my parents said I mattered less. No clear line that separated my role from my sister's. It was built through years of small decisions, small dismissals, small sacrifices that only went one way. And because it was never openly discussed, it was easy for them to deny it, to frame it as misunderstanding, to say I was overthinking things whenever I tried to bring it up. And eventually, I stopped trying. Not because I agreed with them, but because I realized that in that house, the version of me they believed in was already decided, and nothing I said was going to change it. The shift from being misunderstood to being accused didn't happen overnight. It built quietly, almost carefully, starting with small claims that were easy to dismiss. My sister would say I had taken her things without asking, that I had said something unkind to her when no one else was around, and when I tried to explain, to clarify, my parents would listen just long enough to appear fair before asking me to let it go, to be the bigger person, to not escalate the situation. And at first, I thought it was just another version of the same pattern, another way I was expected to absorb tension so the family could stay intact. Then the accusations changed. They became more specific, more serious, and harder to ignore. My sister started telling them that I was aggressive, that I intimidated her, that I made her feel unsafe in her own home. And the way she said it wasn't emotional or impulsive, it was controlled, almost rehearsed, as if she had thought through exactly what words would carry the most weight. And when my parents confronted me, they didn't ask open questions. They presented the situation as something they were already trying to manage, something they expected me to admit to rather than explain. What made it impossible to dismiss were the things she showed them, screenshots of messages that appeared to come from me, messages I had never written, saying things I would never say, and when I tried to point that out, to explain that something wasn't right, the conversation didn't move in that direction. Because there was more. A photo of a bruise on her arm, dark enough to look real, recent enough to feel urgent, and suddenly the situation wasn't about words anymore. It was about evidence, about something visible, something that confirmed the version of events she had already created. I remember standing in the living room, trying to piece together what I was seeing, what I was hearing, and realizing that this wasn't spontaneous. It wasn't a misunderstanding that had escalated. It had been prepared, built piece by piece in a way that made it difficult to challenge, and the more I tried to defend myself, the more it sounded like denial, like someone avoiding responsibility, because in that moment, everything I said was filtered through what they already believed about me. My father's reaction was immediate and absolute. He didn't raise his voice at first, didn't make a scene. He just looked at me in a way I had never seen before, not frustrated, not disappointed, but certain, as if he had reached a conclusion that didn't require further discussion. And when he finally spoke, his words were calm but final. "You're not safe to be in this house." And for a second I thought I had misunderstood, that he was trying to create distance temporarily, that this was about cooling off. But then he moved toward the door, opened it, and everything became clear. It was raining hard that night, the kind of storm where the sound of it fills the entire space, where stepping outside means being soaked within seconds, and I remember hesitating, not because I didn't understand what he was asking, but because I couldn't process that he meant it literally, that he expected me to leave, to step out into that storm with nowhere to go. And when I looked back, waiting for my mother to say something, to stop it, to question it, she didn't. She stayed where she was, her attention still on my sister, as if the decision had already been made and didn't need to be revisited. I stepped outside because I didn't know what else to do. The door closed behind me with a finality that felt heavier than the storm itself, and as I stood there, the rain hitting my face, my clothes already soaked through, I realized that whatever version of me they had believed in, whatever story they had accepted, had just replaced everything else, everything I had tried to be, everything I had actually done. And in that moment, I wasn't their daughter anymore. I was a problem they had decided to remove. But that wasn't the worst part. The next few days unfolded in a way that made it clear this wasn't just a family decision. It was something larger, something that had already started spreading beyond the walls of that house, because when I tried to reach out to the few friends I trusted, the responses I got didn't match the relationships I thought I had. Messages came back delayed, short, careful, and when I finally spoke to one of them on the phone, there was a hesitation in her voice that hadn't been there before. She asked questions that sounded less like concern and more like confirmation, as if she had already heard a version of the story and was trying to see how mine compared to it. And when I explained what had actually happened, she didn't argue, she didn't accuse me directly, but I could hear it in the silence, the uncertainty, in the distance that had replaced what used to be trust. At school, it was worse in a quieter, more controlled way. Teachers who had once been supportive now watched me more closely, their tone more cautious, their interactions more formal, as if they had been given information that required them to be careful around me. And even though no one said anything outright, the change was obvious. I was no longer just a student. I was someone they were observing, someone they were assessing in a different way, and that shift created a space around me that hadn't existed before, one where people kept their distance not because they didn't know me, but because they thought they did. Rumors moved faster than facts, especially when they came with just enough detail to sound believable, and I began to hear fragments of what was being said. Me that I had issues controlling my anger, that I had hurt someone in my own family, that I wasn't safe to be around when I got upset. And each version was slightly different but carried the same underlying message, that there was something wrong with me, something that explained why I had been removed from my home. And the more those stories circulated, the harder it became to challenge them, because I wasn't just defending myself against one accusation, I was trying to counter a narrative that had already been accepted by people who weren't there. When I tried to contact my parents, to ask them what they had said, to understand how far this had gone, I didn't get an answer. Calls went straight to voicemail. Messages were left unread, and eventually, even the possibility of reaching them disappeared, as if they had decided that cutting me off completely was easier than addressing what had happened, and that silence said more than any explanation could have. It confirmed that this wasn't temporary. It wasn't something they intended to revisit once things calmed down. It was a complete break. A decision to remove me not just from their house, but from their lives. The final realization came when I overheard a conversation that wasn't meant for me. Two parents speaking in low voices outside the school office, one of them mentioning my name, explaining to the other that there had been some issues at home, that I was struggling with mental health, that my family was doing what they could to manage the situation. And the way it was said, calm, concerned, almost sympathetic, made it sound reasonable. Made it sound like a responsible explanation, but I knew what it really was. It was a version of the story that removed any doubt, that justified what had been done to me by framing it as necessary. In that moment, I understood that I wasn't just being pushed away, I was being redefined, turned into something easier for everyone else to accept. And once that version of me existed, once it had been shared and repeated, it didn't matter what I said or how I tried to explain it. Because I wasn't just fighting to be heard anymore, I was fighting against a story that had already been decided without me. That night, the storm didn't ease the way I kept hoping it would. It only grew heavier, the rain coming down in sheets that blurred everything beyond a few feet in front of me. And as I walked away from the house, I didn't have a destination, just a direction, because going back wasn't an option anymore. Not after the door had closed behind me in a way that felt final. Not after the look on my father's face made it clear there was nothing left to explain, nothing left to fix. And for the first time, the reality of it settled in without anything to soften it. I had no money, no plan, and no one I could rely on to take me in. I tried calling people anyway, standing under the edge of a building just long enough to keep my phone from getting soaked, scrolling through contacts, choosing names that once felt safe, and one by one, the calls either went unanswered or ended quickly, Excuses about not being able to help, about parents being home, about not wanting to get involved, and none of it sounded cruel on the surface. But the result was the same. I was alone. And every attempt to change that only confirmed it more clearly. The cold set in slowly, at first just uncomfortable, then sharp enough to make it hard to focus. My clothes clinging to me, my shoes heavy with water, each step taking more effort than the last, and I remember thinking in small, practical terms. Where could I go to stay dry? Where could I sit long enough to figure out what to do next? But every place I considered was closed, locked, or too far away to reach in that weather. And the longer I walked, the more it felt like I was moving without purpose, just trying to stay in motion because stopping would mean facing the full weight of what had happened. At some point, I realized I was crossing an intersection without really seeing it. The rain distorting the lights, the sound of the wind overpowering everything else. And the moment before it happened was almost silent, a brief break in the noise before the headlights cut through the darkness, too close, too fast, and I didn't have time to react in any meaningful way. Just a split second of awareness before the impact hit, and everything shifted. The force knocked me sideways, the world tilting in a way that didn't make sense, the ground coming up harder than I expected. And for a moment, I couldn't tell where the pain was coming from because it felt like it was everywhere at once, sharp and overwhelming, and then everything slowed down. Not physically, but in the way my mind tried to process what was happening. The rain still falling, the sound of a car door opening, footsteps approaching, a voice calling out to me, urgent, unfamiliar, asking if I could hear her. I tried to respond but couldn't form the words, my body not cooperating in the way it should. And as I lay there, barely able to keep my eyes open, one thought surfaced with a clarity that cut through everything else. Not about the accident, not about the pain, but about what had led me there. How I had been standing in my own house just hours earlier, and now I was lying in the middle of the street, with no one who knew where I was, no one expecting me to come back. The voice stayed with me, steady, focused, telling me not to move, telling me help was coming, and as the sound of sirens grew closer, the edges of everything began to fade, the lights blurring, the cold giving way to something heavier, and the last thing I was aware of before everything went dark was the realization that whatever happened next, whatever came after this moment, I wasn't going back to the life I had just left behind. When I woke up in the hospital, the first thing I noticed was the quiet, not the peaceful kind, but the kind that comes from being disconnected from everything familiar. The steady sound of machines replacing the noise of the storm, the ceiling above me unfamiliar, the air carrying that sterile scent that made everything feel distant and controlled. And for a moment, I didn't move. Not because I couldn't, but because I didn't know what I would be returning to if I did. The nurse explained what had happened in simple terms: a concussion, bruising, nothing that would leave permanent damage if I rested. And when she asked if there was someone she could call for me, I hesitated. Not because I didn't know the answer, but because saying it out loud would make it real. There was no one to call, no home to return to, and the look she gave me in response wasn't judgmental, just concerned, as if she had seen this situation before and knew what it meant without needing more explanation. The next few days passed in a strange rhythm. Doctors coming and going, tests being done, questions asked and answered. And through all of it, I stayed where I was because there was nowhere else to go. The hospital becoming a temporary space where I could exist without having to make immediate decisions. And it was there that the social worker first spoke to me, her tone careful but direct, asking about my home situation, about what had happened, about whether I felt safe returning, and each answer I gave moved me further away from the possibility of going back. yet until it was clear to both of us that returning wasn't an option. That was when another possibility appeared, not in a dramatic way, but in a quiet suggestion. The woman who had been at the scene of the accident, the one who had stayed with me until the ambulance arrived, had asked about me, had followed up, and when she learned I had nowhere to go, she offered something unexpected: temporary housing, a place to stay until a more permanent solution could be found. And when I met her properly, not as a blurred figure in the rain, but as someone sitting beside my bed, composed and steady, I realized she wasn't just offering space. She was offering structure, stability, something I hadn't had in a long time. She was a professor, someone who worked in a field that focused on systems, on understanding how people navigate challenges and where those systems fail them. And the way she spoke to me wasn't the way adults had spoken to me before. There was no assumption, no prejudgment, just a clear assessment of what had happened and what could happen next. And when she said I could stay with her, that it would give me time to recover and figure out my next steps, I didn't feel rescued. I felt given a choice. Accepting that choice meant leaving everything else behind completely, not just physically, but structurally. I would need to transfer schools, start over in an environment where no one knew me, where the story that had followed me wouldn't automatically exist. And while that should have felt like relief, there was a part of me that understood what it also meant. I was losing more than a house. I was losing any connection to the life I had known, whatever remained of it. At first, I told myself it was temporary, that things would settle, that maybe my parents would reach out, that something would change once the situation had been processed. But as the days turned into weeks, that expectation faded, replaced by something more grounded, more difficult to accept. There was no call coming, no explanation, no attempt to reconnect, and the silence confirmed what had already been set in motion. I thought everything was over, not just the situation with my family, but the version of my life that had existed before, the plans I had, the identity I had built. Even if it had been shaped by limitations, it had still been something I recognized, and now it was gone, replaced by uncertainty, by a future that didn't have a clear outline. What made it harder was that the narrative about me hadn't stayed behind. It followed me in ways I hadn't expected. Records, conversations between schools, quiet notes that traveled with my name. And when the possibility of enrolling in a new school was discussed, there was hesitation, questions about behavior, about stability, about whether I would be a risk in a different environment. And for a moment, it felt like I might lose even this chance, not because of something I had done, but because of the story that had been built around me. Being labeled a problem child carried weight in ways I hadn't understood before. It wasn't just an opinion, it was something that influenced decisions, something that shaped how people approached me before they even met me. And as I sat there, waiting to see if I would be accepted somewhere new, and I realized that starting over wasn't just about leaving the past behind. It was about finding a way to move forward while carrying a version of that past that I hadn't chosen, but still had to overcome. The turning point didn't come from a single moment of recognition. It came quietly, through observation, through the way she watched how I responded to things most people would overlook, how I listened more than I spoke, how I processed information not just for what it was on the surface but for what it meant underneath. And over time, she began to ask different kinds of questions, not about what had happened to me, but about how I thought, how I understood people, how I connected ideas that didn't seem related at first. One afternoon, she sat across from me at the kitchen table with a set of documents, case studies, reports from her work, and instead of explaining them, she asked me what I saw, what stood out, what didn't make sense. And at first I hesitated, unsure of what she expected. But when I started to answer, I realized she wasn't testing me. She was listening, really listening, and the more I spoke, the more she leaned in, asking follow-up questions, encouraging me to go deeper, to explain not just what I noticed but why it mattered. What surprised me wasn't that I could do it. It was how natural it felt, how the patterns I had learned to recognize in my own life translated into something else, something structured, something useful. I could see where systems failed people, where decisions didn't account for real circumstances, where assumptions created outcomes that didn't match reality, and without realizing it, I had developed a way of thinking that wasn't obvious but was precise in its own way. She saw it before I did. She called it analytical empathy, the ability to understand both the structure of a problem and the human experience within it, to see not just what was happening but how it affected the people involved. And when she said it, it didn't feel like praise. It felt like an explanation for something I had always done without having a name for it. And for the first time, something about me wasn't being framed as a limitation. It was being recognized as a strength. That was when she started talking about possibilities. Not in broad, unrealistic terms, but in specific steps, programs that aligned with how I thought, schools that valued different kinds of intelligence, opportunities that I hadn't considered because they had never been presented to me as options. And she didn't offer them as guarantees. She framed them as paths, things I could work toward if I chose to. And the difference was subtle, but important. She wasn't deciding my future. She was showing me that I had one. The scholarship came up as part of that conversation, not as something I would automatically receive, but as something I could earn, something that would require effort, consistency, and a willingness to step into an environment where I would no longer be defined by what had happened before. And the idea of that was both reassuring and unsettling, because it meant leaving behind even the last pieces of what I had known, but it also meant moving towards something that had been unavailable to me until now. When the acceptance came, it didn't feel like a dramatic victory. It felt quiet, almost unreal. A letter confirming that I had been given a place in a new environment, with support, with structure, with expectations that were based on what I could do rather than what I had been labeled as. And as I held that letter, I understood that this was more than just a change in location. It was a shift in direction, one that had the potential to redefine everything that came next. She didn't celebrate in a way that drew attention to it. She simply acknowledged it, nodded once, and said that this was the beginning, not the outcome, and that what mattered wasn't the opportunity itself, but what I chose to do with it. And as I prepared to step into that new space, I realized that for the first time, I wasn't being pushed into a role I didn't choose. I was stepping into one that I had the chance to shape for myself. The new environment didn't feel like a fresh start at first. It felt like a test. A place where everything I did carried weight, because it was no longer about catching up. It was about proving that I could sustain something real, and I approached it the only way I knew how, with structure, with discipline, with a kind of consistency that didn't depend on how I felt in the moment, but on what I had decided mattered. I built routines that kept me focused, studying late when I needed to, reviewing material until I understood it completely, not because I was trying to outperform anyone, but because I didn't want to lose the opportunity I had been given. Outside of classes, I found myself drawn to spaces that reflected what I had gone through, not out of obligation, but because I understood those experiences in a way that wasn't theoretical. I started volunteering with small programs that supported teenagers in unstable situations, listening more than speaking, offering help where it was needed, And over time, those interactions began to take shape into something more structured, ideas forming about how support systems could be improved, how small changes in access and communication could make a real difference. And without planning it as a long-term goal, I began building something of my own. A program designed to connect young people who had been pushed out of their homes with resources that didn't require them to already be stable. The progress was gradual, almost invisible at first. A few participants, then a few more. Partnerships that started informally and grew into something more reliable. And each step forward wasn't marked by recognition, but by function, by the fact that it worked, that it helped, that it could continue. And those small confirmations became the foundation for everything that followed, the kind of validation that didn't need an audience to be real. The first major acknowledgement came quietly, a letter informing me that I had been awarded a full scholarship based on both academic performance and community impact. And I remember reading it without reacting immediately, not because it didn't matter, but because it felt like a continuation of something I had already been building rather than a sudden change. It allowed me to keep going without interruption, to expand what I was doing without worrying about whether I could afford to stay. The invitation to speak came later, unexpected in a different way. A request from the university to share my work at a larger event, to explain the program, the reasoning behind it, the impact it had started to create. And at first, I hesitated, not because I didn't understand the material, but because speaking publicly required a different kind of presence, one that I hadn't needed before. But as I thought about it, I realized that the work itself was already there, already defined, and all I needed to do was explain it clearly. What I didn't consider at the time was how separate my life had become from the one I had left behind, how completely disconnected it was from the narrative that had once defined me, because while I was building something steady, something that had its own momentum, my family had moved in the opposite direction, not toward understanding, but toward absence. They had stopped asking, stopped searching, stopped acknowledging me entirely, and over time, that absence turned into a conclusion, a quiet assumption that I had disappeared, that whatever had happened to me had led nowhere, that the version of me they had believed in had simply confirmed itself. No one from that part of my life saw what I was doing. No one tracked the progress, the milestones, the moments that mattered. And in a way, that separation became its own form of clarity, because it meant that everything I was building existed without their influence, without their expectations, without the need to prove anything to them. And as the program grew, as the opportunities expanded, I understood that this distance wasn't something I needed to close. It was something that had allowed me to build something that finally belonged to me. The day of the ceremony arrived with a kind of quiet precision. The campus transformed into something larger than itself, rows of chairs stretching across the field, families gathering in groups, voices layered with excitement and expectation, and I stood just beyond the main walkway, watching it all come together from a distance that felt intentional, not because I didn't belong there, but because I understood exactly what this moment represented and what it required from me. I had been invited to speak as the keynote, not because of where I came from, but because of what I had built, the program, the work, the impact that had grown steadily over the years. And when the invitation first came, I accepted it with the same mindset I had applied to everything else, as another step, another responsibility, something to prepare for and execute well. But standing there that morning, seeing the scale of the event, hearing the energy of the crowd, I realized that this was different, not in its importance, but in its reach, in who would be listening. As I reviewed my notes one last time, my attention shifted toward the graduates taking their seats, rows organized by department, names printed neatly on programs held by parents and friends. And that was when I saw her. Not immediately, not in a dramatic way, but in a moment of recognition that settled slowly. My sister, seated among the graduates, dressed in the same cap and gown as everyone else, her posture familiar even from a distance, and for a second, everything around me seemed to pause, not because of the crowd, but because of what that meant. She had no reason to expect me there. As far as she knew, as far as my entire family knew, I was no longer part of any world that intersected with theirs, and that realization extended further as I scanned the audience, seeing faces that belonged to a past I had long since moved beyond. My parents seated among the other families, focused on the stage, waiting for the ceremony to begin, completely unaware that the person they had removed from their lives was standing just a few steps away from becoming part of this moment. No one had connected the names. No one had questioned how the speaker had arrived there. The program listed my full name, but it didn't carry the history they had attached to it. And in that separation, there was a kind of quiet clarity, because everything I had built existed independently of what they had once believed about me. And now, for the first time, those two realities were about to intersect in a way none of them had prepared for. I took a breath, folded my notes, and stepped toward the stage entrance as my name was announced, the sound carrying across the field, drawing attention in a way that felt both familiar and completely new. And as I moved into position, I understood exactly what was about to happen. Not as a surprise, not as something I was discovering in the moment, but as the natural outcome of everything that had come before. They didn't know I was about to step on that stage. I stepped onto the stage as my name was announced, the applause polite at first, the kind reserved for a speaker people didn't yet know, and I took my place at the podium, looking out over a sea of faces that expected something inspiring, something structured, something that fit the moment. And, for the first few minutes, that's exactly what I gave them. I spoke about resilience, about systems that fail people, about what it means to rebuild when support disappears, my voice steady, measured, not rushed, allowing the story to unfold in a way that felt intentional rather than emotional. And as I spoke, I could feel the room settling, attention focusing, people leaning in not because they knew me, but because they recognized the truth in what I was describing. I described a girl without naming her, a teenager who was removed from her home based on something she didn't do, who lost everything in a single night, who had to navigate a world that had already decided who she was without giving her a chance to speak. And I kept my tone even, avoiding anything that sounded exaggerated or dramatic, because the facts were enough on their own. And as I moved through the story, I began to notice small shifts in the audience, subtle changes in posture, in expression, moments where people stopped simply listening and started connecting what they were hearing to something more specific. Then I paused. It wasn't a long pause, just enough to create space, to let the weight of what had been said settle into the silence. And when I spoke again, my voice didn't change, but the meaning did. That girl was me. And the effect was immediate, not loud, not chaotic, but absolute. The kind of silence that moves through a crowd all at once, as if everyone has reached the same realization at the same time. From the stage, I could see it clearly. The moment recognition replaced distance, the way heads turned slightly, the way attention sharpened. And then I saw them, my sister first. Her expression fixed in a way that suggested she was trying to process something that didn't fit with what she believed. Her body still, her focus locked on the stage, and beyond her, my parents, no longer watching casually, no longer part of the general audience, but fully present in a way that made it clear they understood exactly what had just been said. No one interrupted. No one questioned it. Because it wasn't presented as an accusation, it was a statement. One that didn't require validation in that moment because it was supported by everything that had already been established. And as I continued, I shifted the focus away from the past and toward the present, toward the work that had come out of it, the program I had built, the people it supported, the structure that had been created to address the very kind of situation I had experienced, and in doing so, I made it clear that the story wasn't about what had been taken, it was about what had been built in response. The validation came not from me, but from the institution itself. When I finished, the applause that followed was different, not polite, not automatic, but sustained. And as I stepped back, the university president moved forward to acknowledge the work that had been mentioned, speaking about the impact of the program, the number of students it had supported, the partnerships it had formed, confirming in clear terms that what had been described wasn't hypothetical. It was real, measurable, recognized, and as he spoke, additional details were added, affiliations with organizations, coverage from local media, the collaborations that extended beyond the campus, each piece reinforcing the same point from a different angle. What had been revealed wasn't just a personal story, it was a position, a body of work, something that existed independently of the moment and would continue beyond it. And in that space, there was nothing left to question, nothing that could be dismissed or reframed, because the authority behind it didn't come from emotion or opinion. It came from structure, from recognition, from the fact that it had already been built and validated long before anyone in that audience realized who was standing in front of them. As the applause settled and the ceremony moved forward, the shift in the audience didn't disappear. It redirected, turning inward, moving through conversations that no longer sounded casual, and from where I stood, I could see the change most clearly in the section where my family was seated. My sister still in the same position but no longer composed. Her posture rigid, her expression fixed in a way that suggested she was holding on to something that was no longer there, because whatever version of the story she had told, whatever narrative had defined that night years ago, had just been replaced in a single moment, not by confrontation, but by exposure. The people around her were no longer interacting with her the same way. The ease that had existed earlier replaced by a kind of distance that didn't need to be explained. Small shifts in body language, brief glances exchanged between classmates, the quiet recognition that something didn't align with what they had been told. And while no one spoke loudly enough for the entire crowd to hear, the effect was visible, the space around her changing, not dramatically, but enough to signal that the position she had held socially was no longer stable. For the first time, she wasn't controlling the narrative. She wasn't directing how people saw the situation. And that loss showed in the way she looked around, searching for confirmation, for someone to reinforce what she had said before. But there was nothing to reinforce, because the context had shifted beyond her reach. And what remained was the gap between what she had presented and what had just been revealed publicly. My parents reacted differently, not outwardly, not in a way that drew attention, but in a stillness that carried its own weight. They didn't attempt to interrupt, didn't stand, didn't leave. They remained where they were. But the certainty that had defined their decisions in the past was no longer visible, replaced by something quieter, more uncertain, because for the first time, the version of events they had accepted without question was being challenged in a space where they couldn't control the outcome. There was nothing for them to argue against. No accusation made directly at them. No confrontation they could respond to. Just a clear, structured account of what had happened, followed by undeniable evidence of what had been built afterward. And in that context, any attempt to push back would have required them to dismantle not just the story, but everything that supported it. Something that wasn't possible in that moment. As the ceremony continued and people began to stand, to move, to gather with friends and family, the secondary effects became more visible. Conversations forming in small clusters, pieces of the story being discussed, compared, re-evaluated, and within those conversations, patterns emerged, questions about things that hadn't made sense before, inconsistencies that had been overlooked, moments where my sister's version of events didn't fully align with what others had observed at the time. It didn't happen all at once. It didn't need to. Because once doubt entered, it spread naturally, reshaping how everything else was understood. And for my sister, that meant something more immediate. The gradual loss of the social position she had built, not through a single confrontation, but through the quiet withdrawal of trust, the subtle distancing of people who no longer felt certain about what they had believed. No one needed to accuse her directly. No one needed to create a scene. The shift itself was enough. And in that shift, the life she had built around that version of the truth began to come apart. Not dramatically, not in a way that could be stopped, but in a way that was steady, irreversible, and entirely visible to anyone who was paying attention. After the ceremony ended and the crowd began to disperse, the space shifted from something formal to something personal, groups forming, families reuniting, conversations overlapping, and for a moment I stayed where I was, not because I was waiting for anything, but because I wanted to be certain that what I felt wasn't reaction, that it wasn't driven by the intensity of what had just happened, but by something more stable, something I could carry forward without needing to revisit it. I saw them before they reached me, my parents moving through the crowd with a kind of hesitation that hadn't been there before. My sister a step behind them, no longer leading, no longer certain. And when they finally stopped in front of me, there was no immediate confrontation, no raised voices, just a silence that carried everything that hadn't been said for years. And in that silence, I could see the shift. Not just in how they looked at me, but in how they understood what had happened, the certainty they had once held replaced by something more fragile. My mother spoke first, her voice careful, as if choosing each word mattered in a way it hadn't before. She said my name in a way that sounded unfamiliar, softer, uncertain, and for a brief moment, I recognized what she was trying to do, to bridge the distance. To step into a conversation that should have happened a long time ago, but timing doesn't erase impact, and recognition doesn't undo what has already been built in its absence. My father didn't try to explain, didn't justify what had happened. He simply stood there, his presence quieter than I had ever known it to be. And my sister avoided my eyes, not out of defiance, but because there was nothing left to hold on to. No version of events that could stand in that moment. And for a second, I considered what it would mean to stay, to reopen that connection, to step back into something that once defined me. Then I realized I didn't need to, not to prove anything, not to heal something that had been broken for years, not to become the person they could now accept. I looked at them, not with anger, not with resentment, but with a clarity that had taken time to build, and when I spoke, my voice didn't carry weight because it was loud, it carried weight because it was certain. "I forgive you," I said, allowing the words to settle before continuing. "But I don't want you in my life," and there was no hesitation in it, no space for negotiation, because it wasn't a reaction, it was a decision. No one argued, no one tried to stop me. Because the meaning of it was clear. Forgiveness didn't reopen the past. It didn't restore what had been lost. It simply released it. And with that, I stepped back. not away from them in a way that required explanation, but forward into something that no longer depended on their understanding, their approval, or their presence. And as I moved through the crowd, past conversations that no longer included me, into a space that felt entirely my own, I understood that walking away wasn't about leaving something behind. It was about choosing where I belonged, and for the first time, that choice was entirely mine. For a long time, I thought family was something fixed, something defined by where you came from and who raised you, something you were expected to hold on to no matter what happened. But standing there at the end of everything, after everything that had been said and everything that had been revealed, I understood something much simpler and much harder to accept. Family isn't who raised you. It's who stood by you when you needed them most. And that difference changes everything, because it forces you to look at people not for who they are supposed to be in your life, but for what they actually chose to be when it mattered. They threw me out like I didn't belong, like I was something that could be removed without consequence, like my place in that house had never really been mine to begin with, and for a long time, I carried that with me. Not just as a memory, but as a question about where I was supposed to fit, where I was supposed to go. But somewhere along the way, without realizing it, I stopped asking that question. I stopped looking for a place that would accept me, and I started building one instead, piece by piece, choice by choice, until it became something real. So I built a life where I finally did. If you were in my position, would you have forgiven them after 12 years? Would you have given them another chance to be part of your life? Or would you have walked away knowing that some things can't be rebuilt once they're broken? Would you choose to go back or to keep moving forward on your own terms? I want to know what you would do, because these decisions don't have easy answers. They reflect what matters most to you. So tell me, would you forgive or walk away? Comment yes if you would forgive, or no if you would walk away.